There is a moment, right before sleep, when your body goes still, but your mind keeps holding on. A conversation from years ago replays. A face you can't forget. A mistake you already paid for 100 times over. You are lying in the dark, completely motionless, and yet you are still carrying something. That is the moment I want you to sit with tonight. I used to think that letting go meant forgetting. I used to think that if something still hurt, it meant I hadn't healed yet, hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't meditated enough, hadn't prayed enough. But then I learned something that changed everything. Letting go was never about forgetting. It was about no longer needing the weight to prove that something mattered. Tonight, we are going to walk through some old Zen stories, quiet ones, strange ones, the kind that don't explain themselves right away. And through them, we're going to understand what it actually means to release what you cannot change, not by force, not by discipline, but by finally understanding why you were holding it in the first place. Most people think their problem is that they can't let go, but that's not quite true. The real problem is that somewhere along the way, you were taught that holding on was love. That holding on was responsibility. That holding on was proof you were a good person, a careful person, someone who takes life seriously. So you kept holding. The grudge, the regret, the version of yourself you think you should have been, and it got heavier every year, and you called that heaviness being strong. Tonight, we take that weight down and look at it honestly, together. The cup that was already full. There's an old story about a scholar who traveled far to visit a Zen master, wanting to learn everything there was to know about the path. When he arrived, the master offered him tea. He poured and poured, and kept pouring even after the cup was overflowing onto the table, onto the scholar's robes. "Stop! It's full. It can't hold anymore," the scholar said. The master set the teapot down calmly. "Like this cup," he said, "you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you anything until you first empty your cup?" You probably already know this story. It gets told so often that it can start to feel like a slogan instead of something real. But tonight, I want you to slow down and actually sit with it, because underneath the simple image of tea spilling onto a table is something most people never look at closely enough to understand. Have you ever asked yourself what's actually sitting in your cup right now, tonight, as you lie here trying to rest? Not thoughts about tea, obviously, but the old certainties, the story you tell yourself, on repeat, about who hurt you and why they did it. The version of events you've rehearsed so many times that it has hardened into something you call the truth, when really, it's just the version that hurt the least to believe. The belief that you have to understand every painful thing before you're allowed to release it, as if pain comes with a lock and understanding is the only key, and until you find that exact key, you're required to keep carrying the weight of the locked box forever. The idea that healing requires a full explanation first, a tidy narrative, a reason that makes sense of the senseless, that is what fills the cup. And it is heavy, heavier than people admit, because a full cup cannot receive anything new. Think about that plainly, without any spiritual language attached to it. If a cup is already full, and you try to pour more into it, the new liquid doesn't get absorbed. It just spills over the sides and makes a mess of everything around it. That's what happens when you try to invite new peace, new understanding, new ways of living into a mind that is already packed to the brim with old grievances and rehearsed explanations. The peace doesn't get to land anywhere. It just runs off the sides of you and soaks into the table, wasted, while you sit there wondering why you still don't feel any different, no matter how many people tell you to let go. You keep pouring more into something that has no room left, and then you wonder why sleep doesn't come easily anymore. This is not a flaw in your character. It is simply what happens to any container that has never been emptied. Think about your own mind for a moment, honestly, without judging what you find. How much of your daily thinking is actually new? How much of it is the same 3 or 4 old stories, running on a loop, dressed up in slightly different clothing, depending on the day? The argument with your parent that ended 15 years ago, but still plays out in your head, with new dialogue you never got to say. The mistake at work that you've replayed so many times you could recite it like a script. The relationship that ended, where you still construct arguments defending yourself to a person who isn't even listening anymore, who may not even remember the conversation the way you do. This is a full cup. And here's the strange part. A full cup doesn't feel dramatic from the inside. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It just feels like being you. It feels normal, because you've never known your mind any other way. You assume this level of noise, this constant low hum of unresolved thought, is simply what a mind sounds like. But it isn't. It's what a mind sounds like when it has been pouring in, and never once being emptied. The master in the story wasn't cruel to the scholar. He wasn't trying to embarrass him. He was showing him, through an action instead of a lecture, something words alone couldn't teach. That all his learning, all his careful preparation, all his eagerness to be given wisdom, meant nothing while his cup stayed full of what he already believed. You cannot pour peace into a mind that is defending its old positions. You cannot pour rest into a mind that is still building its case, still preparing its argument, still rehearsing what it would say if it ever got the chance. The scholar came seeking something new, but he arrived with his cup already full of everything he thought he already knew, and there was no room for anything else to enter. So tonight, before you drift into sleep, I want you to gently ask yourself, without forcing an answer, what is filling your cup right now? Not to analyze it, not to solve it tonight, because that isn't the goal here, and trying to solve everything before you're allowed to rest is just another form of the same fullness, another way of refusing to set the cup down, even for a few hours. Just notice it. Notice the story that keeps replaying. Notice the explanation you keep needing before you'll allow yourself to move on. Notice the old certainty you've been gripping so tightly that you've forgotten your hand is even closed around something. You don't have to empty the cup completely tonight. That would be asking too much of a single night, of a single video, of a single moment of quiet reflection before sleep. But you can tip it, just slightly. You can let a little of what's inside spill out, not violently, not through force, but the way water naturally finds its way out of any container that's been tilted, even a small amount. Let a little of the old argument go. Let a little of the old explanation you've been demanding from life go unanswered for tonight. Let a little of the certainty soften, just enough to make room for something you haven't felt in a while. The simple, quiet sensation of a mind that isn't defending anything. Because on the other side of that fullness is not emptiness in the frightening sense. It's not nothing. It's room. Room for a thought that isn't rehearsed. Room for a feeling that isn't tangled up in an old story. Room, eventually, for sleep that doesn't have to fight its way past everything you're still holding on to, just to reach you. The cup was never meant to stay full forever. It was only ever meant to be emptied, so it could be filled again with something better. The farmer whose horse ran away. There is another story, maybe the most famous one of all, the kind that gets repeated so often it risks losing its weight. But stay with me, because tonight we're going to slow it down enough to actually feel it again. A farmer's horse ran away. His neighbors came to console him. "What terrible luck," they said, shaking their heads, already deciding what this event meant for his life. The farmer only said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned, and it brought 3 wild horses back with it. Now the farmer was rich in livestock overnight. The neighbors came rushing back, this time to celebrate his incredible good fortune. Surely now, he agreed, it was wonderful news. The farmer said, "Maybe." Not long after, the farmer's son tried to break in one of the wild horses. He was thrown from its back and broke his leg badly. The neighbors returned once more, this time with sympathy again, certain that this was clearly a tragedy, a son now unable to work the farm. The farmer only said, "Maybe." Soon after that, the army swept through the village, conscripting every able-bodied young man for war, a war that most of them would not return from. Because of his broken leg, the farmer's son was spared. He stayed home while other families said goodbye to their sons forever. The neighbors came one final time to celebrate this stroke of luck, and the farmer, once again, simply said, "Maybe." You already sense the teaching here, probably before I even finish explaining it, because this story has traveled so far and wide that most people know its shape, even if they've never heard it told directly. But I want you to sit with something more specific tonight, something that usually gets skipped over in the retelling. Notice how much energy the neighbors spent. Every single time something happened, they rushed in with a verdict. They judged, they decided, immediately and confidently, exactly what each event meant, exactly how it should be felt, exactly where it belonged, on the scale between disaster and blessing. And every single time, they were wrong, because the story wasn't finished yet. It was never finished. It still isn't finished, even now, even after all these retellings, because life doesn't actually stop and let you know when a chapter has ended and its true meaning has been permanently sealed. The farmer spent none of that energy. This is the part worth noticing closely. He wasn't cold. He wasn't detached in some hollow, unfeeling way, pretending nothing touched him. If you read carefully, he isn't described as emotionless. He simply refused to attach a final verdict to something that hadn't finished unfolding. There's a real difference between those two things, and it matters. Being at peace doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means you stop rushing to decide what everything means before it's actually done happening. Think about how much of your own suffering, right now, tonight, comes from exactly what the neighbors were doing. You get some piece of bad news, and within minutes, sometimes within seconds, your mind has already built the entire tragic story around it. This is the worst thing that could have happened. This proves I'm cursed, unlucky, unworthy, doomed to keep losing. You get some piece of good news, and your mind swings the other way just as fast, deciding this means everything is finally fixed, that the hard part is over, that you can stop being careful now. Up and down, exhausting yourself with verdicts about events that are, in truth, still moving, still unfolding, still years away from revealing what they actually meant. This is the first real shift in learning to let go. You stop assigning final meaning to things that are still moving. The breakup that felt like the ending of your entire life might have quietly been the beginning of one you couldn't have imagined while you were still inside the old one. The job you didn't get, the one that felt like proof you weren't good enough, might have been protecting you from years spent somewhere that would have slowly worn you down in ways you can't yet see from where you're standing tonight. The rejection that felt like evidence of your worthlessness might have simply been redirection, life quietly steering you somewhere else while you were busy grieving a door that was never actually meant to open for you. You don't know yet. And here is the part that actually brings relief. If you let it, you don't have to decide tonight. You are allowed to hold the difficult thing that happened to you without rushing to file it under ruined, or meaningless, or unforgivable. You are allowed to simply say, along with the farmer, maybe. Maybe this is bad. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's both, at different times, depending on what still hasn't happened yet. This isn't avoidance. It isn't denial. It's actually a far more honest response than the confident verdicts everyone around you keeps handing out, because it admits the truth that no one wants to sit with, that you cannot know the full meaning of anything while you're still standing in the middle of it. Think about your own life story so far, the long version, not just the recent chapters. Think about something that felt catastrophic 5 or 10 years ago. Does it still hold the exact same meaning now? For most people, when they actually stop and check, the answer is no. Time revealed something the moment itself couldn't. The wound that once felt like the end of everything became, eventually, the place where something unexpected was allowed to grow. Not because the pain wasn't real, it was real, but because the story kept moving, the way stories do, whether you decide to keep judging them or not. So tonight, whatever verdict you've been carrying, about a failure, a loss, a decision you regret, a door that closed, try setting it down, even just for these next few minutes before sleep. You don't have to reverse the verdict. You don't have to force yourself to believe it was secretly good, because that's just another kind of premature judgment, just wearing a nicer disguise. You only have to loosen your grip on needing to know for certain. Let it be unfinished. Let it be, maybe, for tonight. There is a strange, quiet rest that comes from finally putting down the exhausting job of deciding everything, once and for all, before the story has even finished being written. The monk who carried her only once. 2 monks were walking together, bound by vows that forbade them from ever touching a woman. It was a rule they had lived by for years, one of many disciplines meant to keep their minds clear and their path uncomplicated. They came to a river, swollen from recent rain, moving fast and dangerous, where a young woman stood at the edge, clearly afraid to attempt the crossing on her own. Without a word, without hesitation, the older monk lifted her onto his back, carried her safely across the current, and set her down gently on the other side. Then the 2 monks continued walking in silence, back onto the path, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Hours passed. The sun moved lower, and then, finally, the younger monk could no longer hold it in. "How could you carry her?" he burst out. "We took vows. We are not supposed to touch women at all, and yet you carried one, on your own back, for the whole crossing." The older monk looked at him, calm, almost amused by the question. "I set her down by the river," he said, "hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" This is the story that undoes most people, because it names something they don't want named, something that sits a little too close to their own life to be comfortable. You are still carrying things you set down years ago. Not physically, obviously, but in conversation, in memory, in the quiet architecture of who you believe yourself to be. The apology you never received, from someone who has long since moved on with their life, who may not even remember the moment the way you do, who is likely sleeping soundly tonight without a single thought about the wound they left behind in you. The version of your family that let you down, that you keep replaying, keep relitigating in your mind, as if a new verdict might somehow be reached this time, as if enough repetition might finally produce the apology or the change you never got. The person you were at 22, or 17, or 35, who made choices you now judge harshly from the safety of hindsight, choices that felt reasonable, even necessary, at the time, made by someone with less information, less experience, less of everything you now have. All of it was set down long ago. Set down by time, which keeps moving whether you notice or not. Set down by circumstance, which changed the situation entirely, even if your mind didn't get the memo. Set down by simple forward motion, the natural, unavoidable fact that life kept happening after that moment, that new days arrived, that the river was crossed and left behind you mile after mile, but your mind picked it back up. Somewhere along the way, without your full awareness, you reached back, grabbed the old weight, and slung it over your shoulders again, and you have been carrying it ever since, calling it a burden you must bear, when really, and this is the uncomfortable truth the story is pointing toward, it is a burden you choose to bear. Again and again, every single day you decide to pick it back up, instead of leaving it where it was already set down. The younger monk in the story wasn't a bad person. He wasn't cruel or petty. He was simply someone who had never learned the difference between an event and the story we keep telling about the event. The event was brief. A woman needed help. The older monk helped her. It took minutes, maybe less. But the story the younger monk built around it lasted an entire afternoon of walking, an entire internal argument, an entire performance of outrage that had nothing left to attach itself to except his own unwillingness to let the moment end where it actually ended, at the riverbank, hours ago. How much of your own mental energy, tonight, right now, is being spent this exact same way, carrying a woman who was set down at the river hours, months, years ago, replaying an argument that ended long before you stopped replaying it, nursing a resentment towards someone who has likely forgotten the incident entirely, who is not lying awake carrying anything at all, while you continue to walk for miles under a weight that only you are still holding. This isn't a criticism of you. It's simply an honest look at how minds work when they haven't been taught this particular kind of release. The release that says, the moment is over, the crossing was made, and I do not have to keep carrying what was already set down. There's a kind of quiet dignity in what the older monk did. He didn't refuse to help simply because helping might look complicated or require explanation later. He also didn't dwell on it afterward, didn't need to process it out loud, didn't need permission or debate. He acted, fully and completely, and then he let the act become complete. He didn't drag it forward into the next hour, the next mile, the next conversation. This is not coldness. It is actually a deep form of presence. Being able to meet a moment fully, and then let that moment finish being a moment, instead of dragging it endlessly into every moment that follows. Tonight, ask yourself gently who you are still carrying, not to solve it immediately, not to force some dramatic release before sleep, but simply to notice the shape of the weight. Is it a person who hurt you long ago? Is it a version of yourself you haven't forgiven? Is it an old identity, an old failure, an old argument that ended in real time but never ended in your mind? Notice it. Acknowledge that you're the one who picked it back up. And then, just for tonight, consider setting it back down by the river where it was already left. It doesn't mean the crossing didn't happen. It doesn't mean the memory disappears. It simply means you stop carrying, mile after unnecessary mile, something that was already, a long time ago, set down. The weight you mistake for loyalty. Here is something almost nobody tells you, something that sits underneath so much of the suffering people carry, without ever naming it directly. Some of what you carry because you believe, somewhere deep down, that putting it down means betrayal. If you stop grieving, does that mean you love them less? If you stop being angry at what happened to you, does that mean it was somehow okay, somehow excused, somehow acceptable? If you finally forgive yourself for the mistake you made all those years ago, does that mean the mistake didn't matter, that you're letting yourself off too easily, that you're taking the coward's way out of accountability? This is where so many people get stuck, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes for the rest of their lives, if no one ever helps them see the trap they've fallen into. They confuse the weight with the love. They confuse the suffering with the meaning. They believe, without ever quite putting it into words, that pain is the currency that proves something mattered, and that releasing the pain is the same as declaring it never mattered at all. But weight is not proof of love. Sit with that plainly for a moment, without any spiritual language wrapped around it. A mother does not love her child more by carrying stones in her pockets every single day. The stones don't make the love more real. They don't make it more valid. They just make her tired, slower, weighed down, less able to actually show up for the child she claims to be honoring through her own exhaustion. The stones are not love. They are simply stones, mistaken for love because carrying them felt, at some point, like the only available way to prove that the love was real. Grief that has become permanent residence is not honoring the person you lost. This is a hard thing to hear, and I want to be careful with it, because grief itself is not the problem. Grief is natural, necessary, even sacred in its own way. But grief that has calcified into an identity, into a permanent lens through which you view every single day for years afterward, is not the same as grief that is allowed to move, to soften, to eventually make room for joy again, without that joy being treated as a betrayal. The person you lost, if they loved you the way you remember them loving you, did not want your life to stop the day theirs did. They did not want every future birthday, every future laugh, every future ordinary Tuesday to be haunted by the guilt of still being alive, and still, occasionally, feeling good. A slow refusal to keep living the life they would have wanted for you is not honor. It just looks like honor from a distance, because it's dressed in enough sorrow to seem convincing. Anger that has calcified into personality is not justice. This one is harder to admit, because anger often does start as something legitimate, something earned, something entirely appropriate given what happened. But there is a point, often quiet and unmarked, where legitimate anger stops being about the original wound and starts being about identity, where you are no longer angry because of what happened, but because being angry has become a part of how you understand yourself, how you organize your days, how you explain your choices to other people. At that point, the anger is no longer serving justice. It has become a debt that only you are still paying, to someone who may not even remember the transaction, who may be living an entirely different life now, untouched by the daily interest you keep accruing on their behalf. You can release the weight and keep the meaning. This is the part I most want you to hear tonight, because it's the part that usually gets missed entirely. These were never the same thing, the weight and the meaning. You have been treating them as if they're bound together, as if you cannot let go of one without losing the other, as if setting down the suffering automatically erases the significance of what happened. But meaning doesn't require ongoing pain to remain valid. The love you had for someone doesn't evaporate the moment you stop grieving in the same intense way you did at first. The lesson you learned from a painful mistake doesn't disappear the moment you stop punishing yourself for it daily. The seriousness of an injustice done to you doesn't get erased the moment you stop letting it define your every waking thought. Think about someone you've loved deeply, whether they're still here or not. Does honoring them actually require your ongoing suffering? Or would they, if they could see you now, want something entirely different? Want you rested, want you living fully, want the love to live on in how you carry yourself forward rather than in how heavily you carry the loss. Think about the mistake you made that you still won't forgive yourself for. Has the ongoing punishment actually made you a better person, or has it simply kept you stuck, replaying the same self-judgment without ever actually growing past it? Growth requires forward motion. Punishment, extended indefinitely, requires only standing still. Tonight, before sleep comes, I want you to gently separate these two things in your mind, even if only briefly, the weight and the meaning. Let the weight loosen, just slightly. Let it be okay, just for tonight, to feel a little lighter, without that lightness, meaning you've betrayed anyone or anything. The meaning was never dependent on the weight in the first place. It never needed your suffering to remain true. It only ever needed your memory, your growth, your willingness to let the love, the lesson, the significance of what happened carry forward into how you live, not chained to how heavily you continue to punish yourself in its name. The broken bowl filled with gold. There is a Japanese practice called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery, not by hiding the cracks, but by filling them with gold. A bowl shatters, sometimes into several pieces, sometimes into many, and instead of discarding it or trying to disguise the damage with careful, invisible repairs, the artisan mixes gold dust into the lacquer used to mend the breaks. The cracks don't disappear. They become the most visible part of the bowl, gleaming lines running across its surface where it once broke apart. And the strange, quiet truth at the center of this practice is that the bowl becomes more valuable after it breaks, not despite the break, but because of how it was mended. The crack is not disguised. It becomes the most beautiful part of the object, the part people notice first, the part that tells the story of what the bowl survived. Think about what this means for the parts of you that broke. The relationship that ended badly, in a way you never expected and never wanted, leaving you with questions that may never fully be answered. The year you lost to depression, or illness, or grief so heavy it swallowed months at a time. Months you can barely remember now, except as a kind of grey fog you had to somehow walk through. The failure that still makes your chest tighten a little when you remember it, even now, even after all this time. The business that didn't work, the exam you didn't pass, the person you disappointed, the version of your future you had to quietly grieve and let go of because it was never going to happen the way you'd planned. You have probably spent so much energy trying to hide these cracks, trying to look whole in front of other people, performing a version of yourself that appears put together, unshaken, successful, unbroken, because somewhere along the way, you learned that broken things are supposed to be embarrassing, supposed to be hidden, supposed to be fixed quietly, and never spoken of again. So you smile a little too easily when someone asks how you're doing. You give the short version of your story instead of the true one. You keep the cracks tucked under sleeves, under confident tones of voice, under the careful curation of what people are allowed to see. But the story never asked you to hide the break. Read that again, because it matters. Kintsugi doesn't celebrate breaking for its own sake. Breaking still hurts, still costs something, still isn't something to be sought out on purpose. But once the break has already happened, the practice asks something different of you than hiding ever could. It asks you to notice what filled the crack afterward. What did you learn in that year you thought you might not survive? Who did you become on the other side of the failure you were sure would define you forever, in the worst possible way? What tenderness do you now carry toward other broken people, people going through what you went through, that you never had before your own break happened, back when you still believed, quietly, that only weak or careless people ever really broke? That tenderness is the gold. It is not decoration added to hide the wound. It was never meant to disguise the crack. It was meant to be seen. The same way the artisan doesn't sand the gold seams down flush with the rest of the bowl, doesn't try to make it look as if nothing ever happened. The gold sits raised, visible, catching the light differently than the rest of the surface. It says, plainly, to anyone who looks closely, something happened here, something broke, and instead of throwing this away, someone chose to mend it in a way that made the break part of its story instead of its shame. Think about the people in your own life you trust the most, the people whose presence actually feels safe and real, not performative. Chances are, at least some of them are people who have visible cracks of their own, mended in gold. People who don't pretend everything has always gone smoothly for them. People who can talk about the year they fell apart without flinching, without needing to protect you from the truth of it, because they've already made peace with the fact that it happened and it is now simply a part of who they are. You trust them because their wholeness doesn't depend on pretending they were never broken. Their wholeness includes the break. It was built around it, not despite it. This is the invitation tonight, gentle and without pressure. You do not have to keep spending your energy hiding what already broke. The break already happened. It cannot be undone. And trying to disguise it, sand it down, pretend it never occurred, only spends more of your limited energy maintaining a performance instead of actually healing. What if, instead, you let the gold show? What if the depression you survived became something you could speak about honestly, not as a confession you're embarrassed by, but as a chapter you made it through, one that gave you a depth of understanding you didn't have before? What if the failed relationship became not a secret shame you avoid discussing, but simply part of the shape of your life, the part that taught you exactly what you now know to look for, and exactly what you now know you deserve? You are allowed to be a bowl with visible seams of gold running through you. You do not have to be a bowl that was never broken, because that bowl, frankly, has never been tested, has never had to be mended, has never learned what it's capable of surviving. The cracks are not the flaw in your story. They are simply where the light gets in, where the gold was poured, where the evidence of your survival is written plainly across the surface of who you are now, for anyone with eyes to see it. The empty boat. An old teaching describes a man rowing a small boat across a lake, moving through heavy fog that has settled over the water, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. He's alone out there, focused, rowing steadily toward the far shore he can't yet see. Suddenly, without warning, another boat crashes into his, jolting him hard enough to nearly throw him off balance. Furious, certain that someone has been careless, reckless, disrespectful of the quiet he was moving through, he turns around ready to shout, to demand an apology, to release the anger that flared instantly the moment the collision happened. And he finds the boat is empty. It had simply drifted into him, carried by the current, pushed by wind he never noticed, with no one steering it at all. There was no careless rower to blame, no disrespectful stranger who owed him an apology, no target at all for the fury that had risen so quickly inside him. And here is the strange, immediate thing the old teaching points to. His anger, with nowhere to land, dissolves almost instantly. It doesn't linger the way it would have if there had been a person to shout at, a face to be angry with, an actual target to keep the fire burning against. It simply evaporates the moment he realizes there was never anyone there to be angry at in the first place. So much of your pain has been aimed at boats that were, in some very real sense, empty. This doesn't mean the collision didn't happen. It doesn't mean you weren't jolted, weren't hurt, weren't knocked off balance by what someone did or said or failed to do. The impact was real. The consequences were real. But the people who hurt you were often not steering with the kind of clear, deliberate intention your mind has assigned to them in the years since. They were often drifting through their own fog, their own unresolved history, their own fear and confusion and pain, reacting the only way they knew how to react, given everything they were carrying that you couldn't see from where you were standing. This doesn't excuse harm. I want to be very clear about that, Because letting go of anger is not the same as pretending harm didn't happen or that it doesn't matter. What happened to you mattered. The hurt was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged honestly, not minimized, not brushed aside in the name of some forced, premature peace. But it does mean that some of the fury you've kept alive, the fury that has kept you up at night, replaying the same scene over and over, rehearsing what you should have said, imagining the apology you're still waiting for. Some of that fury was aimed at someone who, in that exact moment, might not have even known they were steering at all. They might have been just as lost in their own fog as you were in yours, reacting out of their own wounds, their own limitations, their own unexamined patterns, rather than out of any clear, malicious intention to hurt you specifically. Think about the people who have hurt you the most in your life. Not to excuse them, not to force yourself into some hollow forgiveness you don't actually feel yet, but just to look honestly at what was likely happening on their end of the boat. The parent who said something cutting that you've carried for decades, were they, perhaps, repeating something that had been said to them, something they never healed from, something they passed down without ever meaning to, the way fog gets passed from one boat to the next, without anyone choosing it? The friend who abandoned you at exactly the moment you needed them most, were they, perhaps, so overwhelmed by their own crisis at the time that they simply didn't have the capacity to steer toward you the way you needed, not because you didn't matter, but because they had nothing left to row with? This is not about deciding the harm was acceptable. It's about noticing where you've been directing your anger at a person, when the truer target might actually be the fog itself. The confusion, the unresolved pain, the lack of awareness that causes so much human harm, far more often than deliberate cruelty does. Most people are not villains steering purposefully toward you, aiming to wound you specifically. Most people are simply adrift, reacting out of whatever fog they happen to be lost in that day, that year, that decade of their life. And sometimes that drifting boat happens to crash into yours, leaving you with real damage and no one fully present enough on the other side to take responsibility for it the way you deserve. When you see the boat as empty, the anger has nowhere to dock. It doesn't mean the anger disappears instantly, the way it did for the man in the story. Real human anger toward real human harm is rarely that simple, and it shouldn't be rushed. But something does shift when you stop needing the other boat to have been steered with intention in order to finally set the anger down. You stop waiting for an apology that may never come from someone who may not even understand what they did. You stop needing them to admit fault in order to grant yourself permission to heal. The anger, instead of needing a target to keep burning, is finally allowed to simply pass through you and continue on, the way it was always supposed to, instead of being stored indefinitely in a heart that deserves more room than that. Tonight, think of one boat you've been shouting at for a long time, just one, and ask yourself, gently, without pressure to resolve it completely, is it possible this boat was, at least partly, empty? Is it possible the person steering it, if there even was a steady hand on the oars at all, was as lost in fog as you were? You don't have to forgive them tonight. You don't have to excuse what happened. You only have to consider setting down the part of the anger that has nowhere left to actually land, so that what remains is something lighter, something that finally has room to pass through and move on, instead of circling the same dark water forever. The mountain that doesn't ask to be climbed. A student once asked his teacher, with the kind of urgency young students often carry, desperate for the answer that will finally unlock everything, "How do I find enlightenment?" The teacher didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. "Do you hear the mountain stream?" The student paused, listened, and after a moment said, "Yes." The teacher said simply, "Enter there." That was the entire teaching. No elaborate instructions, no years of prescribed practice laid out in careful steps, no promise of a distant future reward if the student simply worked hard enough for long enough. Just a stream, already flowing, already present, already making its sound, whether the student had been listening for it or not. The teacher wasn't handing him a destination to strive toward. He was pointing him toward something that had been there the entire time, waiting quietly, asking for nothing except to finally be noticed. The mountain doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand your attention or your struggle. It simply is, standing exactly where it has always stood, indifferent to whether you climb it or ignore it entirely, indifferent to whether you spend your whole life striving towards some idea of what lies at its peak, or simply sit quietly at its base and listen to the water moving over stone. It waits, without waiting, in the sense that waiting implies impatience, implies a need for you to hurry up and arrive, and the mountain has no such need. It will still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and long after you're gone, completely unaffected by how urgently or how slowly you approach it. This is what release actually feels like, when it finally happens, and it rarely arrives the way people expect it to. Not a dramatic unburdening, not fireworks, not some cinematic single moment where you throw the weight off your shoulders forever in front of a sunset while music swells behind you. Real release is quieter than that, almost embarrassingly ordinary in how it arrives. It is simply, one day you notice the stream. You notice that the old thought, the one that used to arrive with a familiar, sharp ache every single time, didn't come with the same intensity this time. It still came. The memory is still there. But the ache that used to accompany it, automatically, reliably, like clockwork, was somehow a little softer, a little further away, a little less able to reach all the way into your chest the way it once could. You notice you can say the person's name without your chest tightening the way it used to, not because you forgot them, not because what happened between you stopped mattering, but because time and quiet attention did something slow and invisible that no single dramatic moment could have done as thoroughly. You notice that a photograph, an old song, a place you used to associate entirely with pain, has quietly become just a photograph, just a song, just a place again, still meaningful, but no longer a trap that pulls you instantly back into old suffering every single time you encounter it. You didn't force this. This is the part worth sitting with tonight, because so much of how we're taught to approach healing involves force. Push through it. Fight for your peace. Do the work, relentlessly, exhaustively, as if peace is a mountain you climb, through sheer willpower alone, foothold by foothold, refusing to rest until you reach some summit where suffering finally ends. But the story doesn't say the student climbed anything. It says he listened. He noticed something that had already been there, flowing quietly, patiently, the whole time he'd been so focused on searching for something more dramatic, more effortful, more worthy of the difficulty he assumed enlightenment was supposed to require. You just finally stopped blocking your own ears from what had already been waiting to be heard. Think about how much of your suffering, especially at night, especially in these quiet hours before sleep, comes not from the original wound, but from the constant effort of straining against it, fighting it, demanding that it resolve itself faster, on your terms, according to your timeline. The stream was there the whole time. Your own capacity to heal, to soften, to find rest, was there the whole time, running quietly beneath the noise of everything you were doing to try to force your way toward peace. You didn't need to climb the mountain. You needed to stop, for just a moment, and listen to what was already flowing at its base. This doesn't mean healing requires no effort at all, or that you should simply wait passively for peace to arrive without ever doing anything. But it does mean that some of the exhaustion you've felt on this path, the exhaustion of trying so hard to fix yourself, to force forgiveness, to manufacture peace on command, might be misplaced effort, aimed at a mountain that was never asking to be climbed in the first place. What if, instead, tonight, you simply listened? Not for a dramatic breakthrough, not for a sudden and complete resolution of everything you've been carrying, but for the quiet, ordinary sound of something in you that is already, slowly, softening. Already, slowly, healing, in its own time, at its own pace, the way water moves over stone, patient, persistent, requiring no permission and no forcing, only your willingness to finally stop straining and start listening. Where the fog finally lifts. Here is the moment I want you to remember, long after this video ends, long after you've fallen asleep tonight and woken up tomorrow and moved on into whatever the next day brings you. The wait was never the price of love. Sit with that for a moment, because it undoes so much of what you've probably believed for years without ever questioning it. You were never required to suffer in order to prove that something mattered to you. The suffering was never the receipt. It was never the evidence submitted to some invisible court that would otherwise doubt whether your love, your loyalty, your seriousness about life was real. The wait was simply the thing your fear told you to hold on to, because your fear did not trust you to survive without it. Your fear believed, quietly and persistently, that if you ever set the weight down, something terrible would happen. You would forget. You would stop caring. You would somehow prove that the pain, the person, the moment, never mattered in the first place. But fear is not a reliable narrator. Fear has never once been right about what you can actually survive. But you have survived worse things than letting go. Think about that plainly, without any exaggeration needed, because it's simply true. You have survived the actual events, the losses, the betrayals, the mistakes, the years that felt unbearable while you were living through them. You survived those. The letting go that comes after, the quiet unclenching of a fist that has been closed for a long time, is nowhere near as dangerous as your fear has led you to believe. You have survived the breaking, the bowl already shattered, and you are, right now, tonight, still here, still breathing, still capable of listening to a story like this one and feeling something move in you. You will survive the release too. This isn't a hope. It's simply the next obvious step in a pattern you've already proven, over and over, throughout your entire life so far, that you are far more resilient than the fear inside you gives you credit for. And on the other side of it is not emptiness. This is the part people fear most, I think, when they imagine letting go, that underneath the weight is nothing at all, a kind of hollow, meaningless space where the grief or the anger or the old story used to live. But that isn't what's actually there. On the other side of it is room for rest, real rest, the kind that doesn't come with one eye still open, still guarding old wounds, still bracing for whatever might come next. Room for a version of your life that is not organized around old pain, where your choices, your relationships, your sense of who you are no longer built entirely around defending against something that already happened and cannot happen again in exactly that same way. Room, finally, for sleep that isn't interrupted by ghosts you keep inviting back in, night after night, out of habit more than necessity, because you forgot you were even the one holding the door open for them. Let the boat be empty tonight. Let the anger that has nowhere real to land finally pass through you, instead of circling the same dark water it's been circling for years. Let the woman be set down by the river, hours ago, the way she was always meant to be, instead of carried for miles further than she was ever meant to travel. Let the cup be poured out, even just a little, so that something new finally has somewhere to land, instead of spilling uselessly over the sides of a mind that never made room for it. You do not have to decide, tonight, what any of it meant. The farmer never needed a final answer either. You only have to stop carrying it for a few hours, just for tonight, and see how light your own breathing becomes when you finally do. See how much space opens up inside your chest when you're not holding your breath against an old wound that has already, in its own quiet way, finished happening. The gold is already in the cracks. The stream is already flowing at the base of the mountain. All that's left is for you to finally stop climbing and start listening, and let sleep find you exactly as you are, a little broken, a little mended, and, for tonight, finally, willing to set the weight down. Let the boat be empty tonight. Let the woman be set down by the river. Let the cup be poured out, so something new has somewhere to land. You do not have to decide, tonight, what any of it meant. You only have to stop carrying it for a few hours, and see how light your own breathing becomes when you do. If this brought you even a little peace tonight, let the next video find you the same way, quietly, gently, exactly when you need it.